And welcome back to Low & Co. Boy, is Hong Kong's property market ever in the doldrums. We bought our own apartment back in the heyday of the property boom in early 1997. Ever since then, prices have nosedived, meaning I gotta keep doing this job to pay the damn mortgage. But lately, Hong Kong's housing policy as a whole seems to be a bit of a mess. In 1997, a goal of providing 85,000 homes a year was adopted to take pressure off prices. Now, 3 years later, Chief Executive Churchouse says that goal hasn't existed for the last 2 years. Critics raged when they heard that one. Well, to help us make a little sense of Hong Kong's property market, if that's possible, I'm talking now to Peter Churchouse, Managing Director at Morgan Stanley Dean Witter. What is this? Tong goes back and says that 85,000 goal actually hasn't existed for the last 2 years, but I'm telling you now, what do you take that to mean?
We dropped it. We have to be very confused, that's for sure. However, the odd thing about all of this, although he says the policy has been dropped, they have in fact produced 85,000 housing units last year. In fact, it was about 85,600. We're looking to see about 120,000 produced in the coming year, 90,000 of which will be public sector. So while he says the policy has been dropped, we're still building housing at that sort of rate. So everybody has to be confused, and I think there's a real credibility issue that many investors are really looking at right now.
Well, let's give poor Mr. Tung a little bit of credit. Then what he's done is he's taken an earlier stated goal and put it into action, and indeed
he should have declared
himself.
Victory.
He's a victor. Why is everybody harping on the man then?
Well, that's exactly right. He's coming out as being on the defensive. In actual fact, he should be on the offensive, not the defensive. He's actually achieved the objective. He's achieved the goal that they originally set out to achieve. However, I think he's been, perhaps government officials have been a little nervous that the property market has been so weak. Residential property prices recovered in the latter part of '98, the early part of last year, by about 15%. But since the middle of last year, when the Fed began tightening interest rates again, property prices have drifted down, transactions volumes have tailed off, and we're seeing a fairly depressed market right now, in the residential sector at least.
There's a lot of criticism in the market that Tung has to, at least to some degree, off the record, answer to the property tycoons, the guys who run Hong Kong, ostensibly. How true is that?
I'm not sure that's strictly correct. I think there's a lot of media attention focused on this. There's the talk of a property cartel. I don't think there's a cartel. There's a small band of big developers, for sure, who actually produce between 60 and 70% of all private housing. But they are in competition. They don't. I don't think they put that much pressure on the administration. Of course, like any interest group, they have their vested interests, and they're going to push for those vested interests, just like anybody else, like the banking sector, like the labor unions, like the social workers, like the teachers, anybody else. They have a vested interest.
You know, for a long, long time, the public housing sector and the private housing sector have been at odds. They're competing against each other. The Hong Kong government takes our hard-earned tax money, turns around, produces flats that are subsidized, whether it's the so-called private sector participation scheme, whether they're bought or rented or whatever. A lot of people get the benefit of subsidized housing, which those of us in the private sector don't get. Does this policy as a whole need a 100% revamp?
I think the whole land policy needs a revamp. It's not so much housing policy as land policy. This administration is a monopoly supplier of land. That's effectively what it is. And it does what any good monopolist does. It restricts the supply of its product to keep prices high. In fact, Hong Kong is a ridiculous situation. We're the 7th or 10th richest country in the world in terms of per capita GDP, but routinely over the last 20 years, only about 20–25% of the population can realistically afford housing. That seems a crazy situation in a country that really is so rich. And that really comes back to this government land policy. It drip feeds land onto the market at a very slow rate, typically, and that keeps prices high. And it means basically people can't afford. So what's happening is business and the richer elements of the community are funding, with their high land cost, they're funding the necessity to provide subsidized housing for 70–75% of the population.
If I can use Singapore as a parallel, how come Singapore has been able to rejuvenate its property sector? Property prices have come back quite nicely, and we're still sitting here in the doldrums, a lot of us, myself not included, fortunately sitting on these negative equity situations where our mortgages are actually larger than the market value of our homes.
Well, I think you've got to look at Singapore as not a private sector situation. Nearly 80–85% of the total housing production in Singapore is provided by the government. So it's not a private situation there at all. So it is very subsidized as well in Singapore. Singapore, however, I think has escaped the worst of the economic recession by virtue of the fact that it's been able to devalue its currency. Hong Kong has not been able to do that with its pegged currency, and as a result the recession in Singapore has not been that bad. We didn't have minus 5% growth in Singapore like we've had here. We didn't have minus 20% retail sales in Hong Kong like we've in Singapore. So I think really the recession hasn't been so bad, and as a result you've had a much better bounce back. But again, it's softened off a bit in recent months following a very strong recovery last year.
If you could do a little crystal ball gazing, what is going to happen in the market? What do you think the government is going to do, if anything, on their overall land policy? And do you think prices are going to stay stable? Are they going to sink, or are we going to see them shoot back up to 97 levels?
Firstly, on the policy front, I think we're going to see a dramatic overhaul of housing policy in Hong Kong over the coming 1 to 2 years. I think we're probably going to see a dramatic overhaul of land policy and land sales, speeding up planning permissions and conversions of agricultural land to development status and so on. So I think there'll be a big shake-up here. So I think that's a positive sense. However, for residential property, I think it's going to remain pretty weak for the next few months. We've got further interest rates to go up. We think the Fed is going to tighten a little bit further before year end. However, I think the new year is going to bring a sense that interest rates have peaked out. With that, I think you'll see improving consumer sentiment. I'm looking for about 10 or 15% upside next year in the residential market, but not much this year at all.
So your prescription for me in the meantime, keep my day job.
Keep your day job and look forward for the next couple of years. You will see a rebound, and you'll get out of that negative equity situation.
Thank you, Peter. Good prognosis to hear from you. Peter Churchouse, Managing Director, Morgan Stanley Dean Witter on the Hong Kong property market. When Low & Co. returns in a couple of minutes, fashion